Welcome to episode 2 of the Initial NBA Show. Today we got a good one for you. We start out talking about kind of the new NBA rule changes, whether they're good, they're bad, and what potentially the NBA could do different about them. Then we dive into the in-season tournament, which personally I think is a great idea, but we break it down and I kind of give you an idea of why I think the NBA in-season tournament is going to be, honestly, a rousing success. Then we continue with our Rafter Rankings Series. Today we're going up to the Pacific Northwest. Gonna go through Portland Trail Blazers history and figure out who are the top 5 best players in Portland Trail Blazers history. On to that. All right, rule changes. Let's start with the easy one first. The new coaches challenges rule. This one is definitely a big W in terms of rule changes. So, starting this next season, if the first coaches challenge in a game is successful, then that team is given a second challenge to use during the game. This pretty much mimics what exists already in the NFL. In the NFL where teams get a third challenge in a game if the first two are successful. This is kind of a no-brainer type of rule. And honestly, I'm kind of surprised this wasn't implemented back in 2019 when coaches challenges were initially introduced, especially because, the NFL had kind of already provided a template on how these should, coaches challenges during a game should be structured. This rule change is really important, at least in my eyes, because anecdotally, from watching games, there's been a bunch of cases where there is a really bad missed call, early in a game, first quarter, first half, whatever. But teams and coaches have been reluctant to use their challenge kind of with the fear that, something's going to come up in, late in the fourth quarter that's really going to swing a game that, they wouldn't be able to challenge because they used it already. Here's some numbers that kind of show that that's been happening with the, how the coaches challenge system has, had been implemented previously. So essentially I found some data from 2020-2021 regular season that was published by the NBA. So this isn't just some random person throwing a data set on the internet. This is actually data from the NBA and aggregates from the NBA. I could only find 2020-21 season. I couldn't find any more recent data, but if someone does have that, hit me up on Instagram or Twitter, so I can take a look at that because I'd be interested to see it. But anyway, during the 2020-2021 season, there were a total of 648 coaches challenges used. Of those 648 challenges that were used, 334 of them were used in the fourth quarter. So that comes out to 51.1%, so just over half. On the other end of that, only 35 of the 648 challenges were used in the first quarter. And then only 102 of the 648 were used in the second quarter. So you're talking the first half combined, coaches only used 21.1% of all challenges. But then over 50%, 51.1% to be exact, were being used in the fourth quarter. So, using those numbers, assuming that missed calls are relatively even, regardless of where in the game you are, which I think is a relatively safe assumption, that essentially means that there were a disproportionate number of bad calls being let go early in the game due to teams wanting to save their challenge later on. So essentially what this new rule change will do will allow teams to challenge some of those really bad missed calls early on in the game and still have that challenge available in the fourth quarter. Some of the missed calls that happen early in the game, over the course of the game, it's maybe one play or one foul or whatever it is. But it could have a big impact as the game closes, right? Think about, maybe they don't challenge a foul call on a guy. He ends up with 3 at some point in, the late first, early second quarter, and that guy ends up fouling out. If you're able to challenge a bad foul call early on, that guy doesn't foul out late in the game. Their scenario would be challenging a missed goaltending, right? They let the basket stand, If you would have challenged, it's taking 2 or 3 points off the score, and if it's a close game, that 2 or 3 points could really matter. So this is a great rule change. Another thing that I found interesting, just looking at that data the NBA published, of all those challenges that happened in the first quarter during that season, all 35 of them were related to called fouls. So every single time that a team challenged early in a game during that season, every single time it was to prevent a guy from getting into foul trouble early, because that's really the only reason you would challenge a foul call early on in the game. So I found that just kind of a little interesting nugget, I guess, looking at that data the NBA published. So when it comes to coaches' challenges, this is obviously a good rule change for the NBA. It just makes sense. But it does bring up a question I have when it comes to just challenge systems in general. And this is both the NBA and NFL. Why are we limiting it to 2 or 3 challenges? And let me explain. So obviously we don't want cases where coaches are challenging every single play that happens, right? But I don't see a reason why you couldn't create a system where challenges can be unlimited as long as they continue to be right. So, if an NBA team, for example, if they challenge one, they get it right, they get a second. Okay, something else happens, they challenge the second call, they get it right, they get a third. Later on in the game, there's another missed call, they challenge that third call, they get it right. Why not get a fourth? I don't understand why we're kind of limiting it to 2 regardless. I understand that, there could be a case where, theoretically, a team gets 6, 7, 8, 9 challenges during a game, but it's because they're right every single time under this, my own proposed system, I guess. And I think if you end up with a case like that, there are bigger issues than a game running long because of a bunch of challenges, right? At that point, it's what the hell are the referees doing during that game to miss so many obvious calls where they're challenged? So yeah, just something that I always think about whenever anything related to challenges comes up, where, I think the perfect challenge system would be to continue to allow teams to get new challenges as long as they continue to be right. Because again, if you have 2 challenges during a game, max, but the refs missed 4 calls that are completely obvious, why should a team get penalized for that? All right, so now for flopping. So the NBA, this is kind of the second big rule the NBA implemented. So this rule enables refs to call a non-unsportsmanlike technical foul that results in a free throw for the opposing team. So it's that non-unsportsmanlike is a really important distinction. So basically it'll be similar to a defensive 3-second violation. So players cannot be ejected for multiple flopping violations like they could with a normal technical foul. And there's no chance of suspension, right? Because of their aggregated system of, if you get, I think it's 16 technical fouls over the course of a season, you're suspended a game. And then there's, kind of increased penalties after that. So these flopping violations, they won't count towards those things. So with this new rule, referees won't need to stop play in order to call a technical flopping foul, and they're essentially able to call it, whenever the next stoppage of play is, which, in my opinion, is the correct way to do it. If someone flops, just kind of play on, and then kind of, hit them after, right, whenever there's some natural stoppage in play. These fouls also don't result in a change of possession, which again I think is a smart way to do it. So if an offensive player flops, they're just going to let it play out, and then just assess that technical with the next dead ball. Also, in addition to the in-game free throw, there's also going to be a fine for the players who flopped. I guess it according to what I read, it starts at $2,000 and kind of increases for repeat violations. So when it comes to this new rule, I like the idea behind it. I kind of get what they're trying to do. But when it comes to any, I think, in-game rule like this, how often will it actually be enforced, especially on star players? Will officials actually call this in crunch time of a close game? on, an egregious flop, or, if LeBron or Harden or whoever it is flops, will the refs swallow the whistle because it's, a close game or we're in the playoffs or whatever it is. So while in theory I like the idea of penalizing flopping mid-game, obviously it's very difficult to do. So I think more times than not, I think referees probably will. It'll be tough for referees to call this, because and we all know that the first time this happens in a big game against a star player, it's going to be the only thing ESPN talks about for the next 24-hour cycle, and usually referees are not super into being the center of attention, and that's kind of what you're opening yourself up to if you're the one that calls this flopping technical that results in a win for a team because of that extra free throw. So I guess we'll see what happens. But I mean, the other thing I'm not, I get why they did it this way, but having it be a non-unsportsmanlike technical foul where it doesn't count towards ejection or suspension, I think it really allows for a lot of testing by the players. They're going to push the boundaries on, what they can get away with in terms of flopping. And honestly, if the NBA really wants to get rid of flopping, you can't allow the wiggle room for players to kind of test, what they can and can't get away with, right? I also understand that, if you went stricter where it was an unsportsmanlike technical foul where it attributed to suspension or ejection, that obviously makes it much tougher on the officials to call that, because that truly is impacting the game more than just that one technical free throw. I think if the NBA truly wants to get rid of flopping, which, I mean, honestly, I don't think the NBA needs to absolutely get rid of it. At this point, it's just kind of part of the game. And it's, trying to accentuate contact, and, flop is kind of a thing that's going to happen as a result of that. But, if the NBA truly wanted to get rid of flopping, I think they need to be much stricter in their approach. Like I said, make these unsportsmanlike technical fouls. I think that would give players more incentive to not even try to flop, since, those unsportsmanlike technical fouls count towards ejection and suspension. They're much more impactful to the offending team, and then, the offending player's wallet, because, there's obviously bigger fines when you get ejected, and when it's an unsportsmanlike technical foul, and obviously if you get suspended for a game, that's a game paycheck you're missing. So, as this rule is currently going to be implemented, I think it's still worth players to try to attempt to flop to get a call, especially late in games. Because in all honesty, that just one technical free throw, similar to a 3-second violation, is pretty minor of a penalty. You think about the 3-second violations, players right now really push what 3 seconds is. So just kind of using that as having a similar penalty, they're going to do the same thing with flopping 100%. The other thing the NBA could do to if they truly wanted to get rid of flopping, is to retroactively assign technical fouls post game. I don't see why they wouldn't have the resources and the capacity to literally just go through every game, every call. Every time someone is flying with arms flailing, I don't understand why they couldn't the next day have someone or, a small group of people just go through those games, determine what truly was a flop, what was not, and then retroactively penalize those players for it. It's not like the NBA has never retroactively assessed technical fouls. They've done it multiple times. For example, they did it to Goran Dragic back in 2016 for essentially swinging on Corey Joseph in the playoffs. So I don't understand why the NBA couldn't just, go back and assign technical fouls after the fact and then fine players. I think that would do a lot to kind of curb this behavior. Again, if the NBA truly wanted to get rid of it, personally, I don't think it's a huge deal, and the NBA may not actually want to get rid of it to that extent. And then the third thing, which I didn't even know this existed until I was looking into this, the NBA could have just utilized the rules already in place set that, to fine flopping violations. So the NBA already has a rule and the ability to actually fine players for flopping after games, like essentially going through the game film and saying, hey, that was egregious, we're going to fine you. The issue is the NBA just hasn't used it. So looking at the fines data and Spot Track, which I'm going to be honest, I don't know how far it goes back, but the NBA has been issuing fines for flopping since 2012, so the last 11 years. The issue is only 2 of the total 31 fines they've given for flopping have been within the last 7 years. So basically, based on that data that I saw on Spot Track, it's basically in 2012 they fined a couple guys for flopping. And then 2013, 2014 they had some fines for flopping, got them to like 29 total that had happened in like a 3-year span. And then since, there's only been 2 cases where someone's got fined for flopping. So this is a case where the NBA could theoretically just kind of use the rules they already have in place. So yeah, well, in a nutshell, while I think this new flopping rule is a step in the right direction in terms of it's at least penalizing something during games. I just have my concerns on how effective this would truly be, and if the NBA truly wanted to actually completely eliminate flopping, which honestly is probably impossible. There would need to be harsher penalties for players in order to make that happen. So yeah, that's essentially the 2 big rule changes. The flopping thing, yeah, it's fine. It's a step in the right direction. But then the coach's challenge is definitely the right choice. So the last thing I'm going to talk about on this piece, it's not really a rule change, but it's kind of more of a scheduling change, whatever you want to call it. I think it's in a similar category and probably isn't worth its own podcast segment. But the in-season tournament, dude, I love how they implemented this in-season tournament. And I love the idea. Let's just go over, in case you haven't heard about it or you're unsure on what it is, let's just kind of go over the format. So at this point, teams have been split out into essentially 6 groups of 5 teams each. And then they're going to play a group stage round, round robin style, against the 4 other teams in their group throughout the month of November. So if you are familiar with the FIFA World Cup, for example, the group stage, it's a similar idea, right? You play the 4 other teams that are in your group. Then the top 8 teams from those groups, so essentially the 6 winners of the group, and I'm based on record, and I'm assuming the NBA will have tiebreakers and stuff. I haven't really seen anything around the specifics of that. So there's going to be 6 group winners and then 2 wildcard teams. Again, I'm assuming that's just based on the next 2 best records, probably with some tiebreakers in there. I'd assume you would need that. So those 8 teams are going to play a 1-game knockout tournament in the with semifinals and finals being played in Las Vegas in early December. So essentially, it almost is kind of set up exactly like the FIFA World Cup, right? You have the group stage, then you have the teams getting out of the groups to a single elimination knockout round, which is always the most exciting. Single elimination knockouts, part of the reason why the NFL playoffs are so exciting. Anytime you have a single elimination game, it leaves open the opportunity for basically anything happening. So the finals winners will end up winning what's going to be called the NBA Cup, and then the NBA is going to name a tournament MVP and have an all-tournament team as well. For the players, the big benefit's prize money. They've essentially allocated, I think I read it was $18 million overall, where as prize money that'll be allocated to players based on kind of how far their teams advance. So there will be incentive for teams not to necessarily just throw away early season games, because I think they said the champions or whoever wins the cup, that team, I think it was $500K per player that they get. And then when it comes to the scheduling of this, and this is where I think they did this the absolute correct way. Every single game of this tournament, outside of that finals game that'll be in Vegas, all of them count towards the regular season standings. So essentially, if your team ends up getting all the way to the finals. That those two teams will end up playing 83 games this season. However, if you didn't make the knockout rounds, the NBA is going to kind of schedule additional games throughout the season, so everyone hits that 82 game schedule. But the good thing about this is they really didn't add any additional games outside of that except for two teams will have one extra game. They didn't add any additional games to have this tournament happen. I think that was always, at least from what I heard and saw, and honestly, my concern is, if everyone's trying to reduce the number of games, if you add an in-season tournament, there was concern that, hey, you're going to just add more games on top of the 82 that the players already don't want. So them having this kind of count towards a regular season, as well as, obviously the tournament itself, super smart way to do it, because you're really not doing anything different in terms of, scheduling. You're just kind of saying, hey, these games are also counting towards this tournament, with a chance of, you going, winning some extra money basically off of it. So yeah, absolutely love this idea. This has been talked about for years, about having an in-season tournament similar to what's seen in soccer. Again, think FA Cup in England. They have a very similar idea with a kind of an in-season tournament that has its own trophy and knockout rounds and things like that. I know that out there, and maybe this is just social media kind of just putting cold water on everything. But I know there's a lot of people who aren't super into the idea of an in-season tournament. But I think it was implemented in a really, really smart way, especially because it's the beginning of the season, right? There's a joke that I hear all the time that, the NBA season really doesn't start until the All-Star break, which is, theoretically, it's kind of true, right? Like, most people don't really care about, November, December basketball outside of, like, maybe the Christmas Day games. So this was really smart by the NBA to have some avenue to make some of those November games that are usually just exist there to actually matter. So it'll give some life and excitement, pretty much right off the bat to start the season, which, I'm always in for. Again, since all the games count towards regular season standings, it actually gives teams incentive to actually try, because it is impacting their regular season record. Again, if these were just extra games that didn't count towards anything but the tournament, I guarantee you would not see star players in these games. But because they count towards regular season, you will see, in most cases, you'll see star players play. I think there's going to be a lot of teams where you'll still see players sit, especially when it's second game of back-to-back for some of these games. But at least it doesn't make it so, these games are just written off as extra BS preseason type of things. And then the other thing that I think is cool about this is it gives some of the non-contenders something to be excited about. So, we've seen there are teams that we know are not going to be good, right? But then there's also times where we see some of these teams that we don't think are going to be good. For whatever reason, they just they start the season super hot. You think about the Jazz from last year; they started the season super hot last year. They ended up missing the playoffs, so as a season as a whole wasn't one to really write home about. But to start the season, they're really good. But then you also have really good teams that start slowly. It's the early of the season. They're still kind of recovering from deep playoff runs the year before. So essentially what I'm saying is having this tournament early in the season, I think gives a little more of an even playing field between, good teams and the not so good teams. And I think the way they structured this tournament in terms of single elimination, and the fact it's early in the season, I think gives kind of an opportunity for some lower tier teams to win something and get their fan bases excited about something. Again, especially because it's single elimination, you can 100% see a team like the Charlotte Hornets beat the Milwaukee Bucks in a single elimination tournament for, random stuff happens. In a 7-game series, it's never going to happen. But in a single elimination, one game in a tournament, you just have LaMelo Ball getting hot from deep, and maybe Giannis has a bad game. Like it allows for a little bit more of like kind of a March Madness type of vibe. Obviously, it's not March Madness, but it can help give that like upset type of vibe in a tournament. So yeah, super excited about the tournament. I think they did it in a really smart way. And even though there are people who are not very excited about it, it's going to take a little bit of time, I think, for it to catch on, because it's a new thing and new things are dumb for a lot of the internet. So yeah, we'll see what happens, but I'm on board for the in-season tournament. All right, we're back. Part 2 of the Rafter Rankings Series. Today we're gonna go over the Portland Trailblazers. Last time we went over the San Antonio Spurs, define their top 5 players all time, only considering everything that happened while the players were in San Antonio. So today we are doing the Portland Trailblazers. Blazers are interesting. They don't have the number of big stars like the Lakers or Celtics, but they have a couple of really high-end guys that are, everyone would agree, yeah, they're top 3 players in Trailblazers history. Then you have one other guy that is solidly in that number 4 spot. But then once you get to number 5, there are, probably half a dozen different guys you could choose for that last spot. And with those guys, there's kind of they fall into 2 buckets of all those other guys that are kind of competing for number 5. They either had a long tenure with the team and had some success, right? Maybe an all-star game, all-defensive team, 6-man award, something like that. But nothing crazy. But then there are other guys that have played for the Trailblazers that had much shorter careers with the team comparatively, but they had higher peaks than those in the previous group. They'd have extra all-star honors, all-NBA teams, things like that. So with that in mind, there are kind of 2 guys that I think fit into kind of an honorable mention. They aren't quite in that 5th spot, but they do deserve, I think, to be mentioned. So first, honorable mention, we got Sidney Wicks, drafted by the Trailblazers in 1971, spent 5 years in Portland before being traded to Boston in October 1976. 4-time All-Star while with the Blazers. He was a 1972 Rookie of the Year, was kind of a volume scorer and rebounder back in those days. Averaged 22.3 points per game, which is pretty good. 10.3 rebounds per game. Again, that's pretty dang good. And then 4.1 assists and 1.2 steals. That 4.1 assists kind of tells you he had a little bit of passing to his game. He was, kind of a stat stuffer type of guy for that era. And he actually led the NBA in triple doubles in the 72-73 season. We're talking a small number. There were only 4 of them during that season, but still, he led the NBA, so it counts. So he's second all time in Blazers history in rebounds per game, and he basically didn't miss games, and he played a lot of minutes. Over those 5 years, he only missed 12 games, and he averaged 38.8 minutes per game. So he was a dude, game in, game out, just playing a lot, and putting up pretty big numbers. And honestly, the number of minutes probably helped, or definitely helped with the bigger numbers. He once in a game grabbed 27 rebounds in one game, which was a Blazer record until Enes Freedom broke it in 2021. And he finished top 10 in scoring in the NBA 3 different times. So that shows that he was kind of the lead dog with the Blazers back in that era, at least in that, that short 5-year window. This is pretty much right before the Bill Walton years, and there's a little bit of overlap there. So, at least before Bill Walton got there, he was the main guy. With him, and why I have him as an honorable mention, you could definitely make the argument he was a good stats, bad team guy. We all know those players, right? They are on a crappy team, they put up big numbers, they go to a better team, and they're just not as effective. So, despite the All-Stars, the numbers, top 10 in scoring in the league for 3 different years, they never had a winning record when he was in Portland, and they ended up winning a championship after they left. Again, that's the Bill Walton championship. And also, when he ended up going to Boston, he wasn't nearly as good. So I had him honorable mention, Rookie of the Year, the stats. He's worth mentioning at the very least. Other honorable mention I have is Maurice Lucas. He was probably the other one that was in strong consideration for that number 5 spot. He barely got beat out, but again, worth mentioning him. Another guy that had shorter tenures but kind of a higher ceiling. So drafted by the Blazers in 1976 as part of the NBA-ABA merger. So he was part of the dispersal draft. Spent 4.5 years in Portland across kind of 2 different stints. One lasted until 1980 when he was traded to the Nets. And then he came back to Portland for his final season in 87-88. While he was in Portland, he was a 3-time All-Star and won the 1977 championship with the Blazers. Again, the only championship in Blazers history, unfortunately. So, you definitely get bonus points there if you're one of the main guys on that team, which he was, along with Bill Walton. 1 All-NBA team, 2 All-Defense team, so all-around player for sure. He led the Blazers in scoring both regular season and playoffs when they won the championship in 77. So while Walton was I think the main guy on that team, ended up winning MVP the year after, it was actually Maurice Lucas who led the team in scoring. Not by a whole lot, but he did technically lead the team in scoring by like a point or 2 during that championship run. While in Portland, he averaged 15.6 points, 8.7 rebounds, and 2.5 assists. His number was retired by the Blazers in 1988. And his kind of biggest, skill set is kind of a non-traditional one nowadays, especially for a player that put up the numbers he did. His nickname was the Enforcer, and he was essentially the enforcer of their team. You think of when you think of enforcers, you think hockey nowadays, but I mean this was kind of a rollback in the 70s and 80s, and we've seen the videos of how crazy some of those fouls and games could get. In fact, he kind of helped to spark the Blazers championship run. There was a brawl in Game 2 in the 1977 finals against the 76ers, and it's kind of commonly looked at as that being the turning point of the series. In a nutshell, 76ers, they were up big in the final minutes of Game 2. They were going to go up and eventually did go up 2-0 in that series. But Daryl Dawkins on the 76ers committed a hard foul against one of the Blazers players. And Lucas, took exception to that for sure. What was definitely looked like a dirty play. If you watch the YouTube video, he kind of stuck up for his teammate. He ended up getting ejected with Daryl Dawkins. There were a couple punches thrown in that whole, whatever you want to call it, kerfuffle, I guess. But it ended up sparking the Blazers. They won the next 4 straight games to win the title. As a player, Lucas was an aggressive rebounder, good offensive player. But again, despite being an all-around great player, especially defensively, he was known for his physicality as an enforcer. It's also kind of a fun fact, and I didn't know this until I did all this research. Bill Walton named one of his kids after Lucas. You guys know him, Luke Walton? Yeah, played for the Lakers. At one point was assistant coach to the Warriors, Luke Walton, that guy. He was actually named after Maurice Lucas, Maurice Lucas was one of Bill Walton's best friends. So those are the 2 honorable mentions I have. Lucas and Wicks. There are a bunch of other guys you could argue to be in this honorable mention spot, even number 5, which we're about to get to. There's Rasheed Wallace, there's Clifford Robinson, Terry Porter, Jim Paxson. All those guys kind of fit into that longer tenure, but not quite the peak as these other guys. So that's why I went with Lucas and Wicks. Both had shorter tenures with Portland, which, as you'll see as we get to the rest of this list, ends up kind of being a theme. But they had the higher peak with the championship, All NBA, and then the Rookie of the Year, additional All Stars, things like that. So I kind of opted in general for kind of the higher peaks over good production, but longer tenures that aren't quite as impactful. So now for number 5. At number 5, we have kind of one of the biggest what ifs in NBA history. At least in Blazers history, it's one of the bigger ones, which is crazy. It may not even be the biggest in Blazers history. I had to put this guy at number 5 because I think he had the highest peak of everyone outside of that top 4 surefire all-time Blazers. He had a short tenure like Wicks and Lucas, and I almost put Lucas in this spot, but at number 5 I opted for Brandon Roy. Since those Blazers teams, he was that first option with LaMarcus Aldridge, being a really close number 2. Whereas Lucas was, even though he scored more points, was kind of more of the second fiddle to Walton, MVP. So you kind of have to be second fiddle to that guy. And also part of it too is, I personally didn't get to see Lucas play. I remember watching Brandon Roy play. He used to smoke the Nuggets every chance he got. And at one point he was one of the best shooting guards in the NBA. It's Kobe Bryant, and then Brandon Roy is probably in that next group. Dwayne Wade was in there. At one point this was probably a top 3 to 5 shooting guard in the NBA. Brandon Roy, technically, again, because NBA draft rules are still kind of dumb, he was drafted by the Timberwolves, but traded to the Blazers on draft day in 2006. Ended up playing in Portland for 5 years. Was waived in 2011 after dealing with those knee issues that ended up ending his career. Even though he ended up playing a couple games in Minnesota after being waived, his career was over. Well before that. He only played 5 games after being waived by Portland, which sucks because we essentially lost all of Brandon Roy's prime. His last healthy season was when he was 25. So think about, guys usually are pretty effective until their early 30s. We missed, I would say, at least 6 really good years of Brandon Roy being a all-NBA, all-star caliber shooting guard. In those 5 years, he was 3-time All-Star, 2-time All-NBA, and 2007 Rookie of the Year. In 2009, he was actually 3rd in offensive win shares. So, his reputation as a clutch certified bucket getter. Offensive win shares are usually a pretty decent metric of that. While in Portland, scored 19 points per game, 4 rebounds, 4.7 assists, a steal, and shot 35% from 3. I found this quote from Kobe that said that Brandon Roy was the toughest player for him to guard in the West when Kobe was asked in 2010. That's from the John Thompson Show. It's a Washington, D.C. radio show. So when a top 3 shooting guard all time, I think it's safe to say, says, hey, you're the toughest player for me to go against, that says a lot about Brandon Roy's offensive game. Like I said, last healthy season was when he was 25. We ended up missing a good 5 to 8 years of one of the best shooting guards in the game if his knee holds up. He had a career high 52 points in 2008 against the Suns. It was just a natural scorer, one of the best scorers in the league during his prime. And also he ended up, while he never, was known for his defense or made an all-defensive team, he did have a game where he recorded 10 steals in 2009 against the Wizards. So that's a lot of freaking steals in one game. So Brandon Roy at number 5. I think he's kind of the one that you could argue, realistically you could argue like probably half a dozen different guys in number 5. But I went with Brandon Roy. So at number 4, it's a guy, we've already talked about this guy on this podcast. He actually was on the Spurs list as an honorable mention. And he was actually drafted in the same year as Brandon Roy. That was 2006 was a ridiculously good draft class for Portland. Number 4, we have LaMarcus Aldridge. Played 9 seasons in Portland after being drafted in 2006. Again, technically drafted by Chicago, but traded to Portland on draft day. Played 9 years before eventually leaving for San Antonio in the summer of 2015, which, again, we've already kind of talked about that. While in Portland, he was a 4-time All-Star, 3-time All-NBA, first-team All-Rookie. So, pretty decent accolades there. Averaged 19.4 points, 8.4 rebounds, and a block in not over 9 seasons. And he actually is still Portland's all-time rebound leader. So high rebound leader, or high rebound numbers, plus, actually playing a long time in Portland, 9 seasons. So that'll make you the all-time leader in rebounds in Portland. Had multiple top 10 finishes in scoring while in Portland. Again, averaged 19.4 points over those 9 seasons. Pretty dang good. But yeah, there's really not much more to be said. We already kind of talked about in the Spurs podcast. Good scorer, good rebounder. Love the mid-range. Love to work at out of the post with that fadeaway jumper. But to me, he's probably the one you could least argue about at number 4, because he's very clearly behind the guys I have at 1 through 3 on this list. And I think because of him playing 9 seasons in Portland versus Brandon Roy's 5, and a lot of those other guys' the short tenures, I think he's definitely ahead of number 5. So number 4 is pretty much where LaMarcus Aldridge, I think, probably fits in pretty much anyone's list if you're ranking all-time Blazers. All right, so when it comes to Portland, there's definitely a pretty clear top 3 players in Walton, Drexler, and Lillard. However, when we start talking about who belongs where in that top 3, that's where you can have a lot of different arguments. So you have Walton, who easily, I think, has the highest peak of the 3, with the championship in 77 and the MVP. The downside, though, is his career in Portland was super short-lived. I think he played only 4 seasons. So that's definitely a minus on his end. But again, brought the city his only championship as its that team's best player and won league MVP. Though I know some people argue he shouldn't have won that MVP. We also have Drexler, who, definitely a long-time Blazer, numerous All-Stars, All-NBAs, but couldn't quite win a championship. They had some really deep playoff runs in the late 80s, early 90s. We're talking about 2 finals appearances in a Western Conference final. But, there are some people who are going to put Walton ahead because of the championship, but then there are other people that are going to put Drexler ahead because of the, better individual success for a longer period of time. This is where these debates can begin, right? Then the other guy, Damian Lillard, who currently, as of right now, this second, is with Portland. We will see what happens over the next couple months. But again, he's a longtime Blazer like Drexler. He has a bit more individual success than Drexler. Additional All-NBA selections, Rookie of the Year, things like that. But he doesn't quite have the playoff success that Drexler had, with really only that one Western Conference Finals run. And we'll kind of get to the differences between those 2 guys a little bit later. So yeah, you have 3 guys that, depending on how you weigh things, you could put them in pretty much any order. Honestly, if I were doing this, trying to rank these top 3 guys again in a month or 2, I might switch the positions of guys one way or another. I think that's how kind of close it is between these 3 guys. So at number 3, I ended up going with Bill Walton. And for me, it entirely comes down to the longevity thing. Drafted first overall in 1974, played 4 years in Portland before he held out in the 78-79 season. That was due to disagreements of how his injuries had been handled by the franchise. So basically, played 4 years. He ended up hurting his foot. I think it was in those 78 playoffs. And he ended up just skipping the next season due to the how his injury was managed, and then ended up leaving as a free agent. So he basically waited out his contract for a year so he could leave Portland. That's how bad that situation ended up becoming, in a pretty short amount of time too. If his injury was in the playoffs of 78 that he had the biggest disagreements with. But regardless, before all of that, he did lead Portland to a championship in 1977. He was a 2-time All-Star. He's obviously in the Hall of Fame. And he was a league MVP in 1978. 2-time first-team All-Defense, a 2-time All-NBA. So you're talking a guy that not only was a offensive juggernaut with MVP, but also a defensive, like a ridiculous defensive player too. Averaged 17.1 points, 13.5 rebounds, 4.4 assists, and 2.6 blocks in his 4 seasons, and ended up leading the NBA in blocks and rebounds in 1977. For his time, he was one of the best, like, do everything centers. He's a great offensive player, great defensive player, but he also is one of the best big men passers of all time. I know this has kind of come up a lot over the last couple of years with Jokic, and we used to say, oh, he's one of the best big man passers of all time. He's like Arvydas Sabonis, and usually Bill Walton's the other guy that got mentioned when trying to find a comp for Jokic. Obviously, now that we've seen Jokic play a little bit longer, he has blown those guys out of the water in terms of his passing ability for a big man. But it kind of shows how good Walton was as a passer, where, you're talking, he is one of the top big man passers of all time, and at least for a little while is being compared to, in my opinion, the best passer of all time, regardless of position. So yeah, I mean, the all defense selections, he was a great shot blocker and rebounder. With Walton, I know there's a lot of people, and I've heard this on other podcasts, just kind of offhand comments, that they would argue that he is the best trailblazer of all time, based on the championship and the MVP alone, essentially saying longevity be damned. Honestly, I don't think that's a terrible argument. Depending on how you view things, how you weigh things, how you're feeling on a particular day, I definitely could see someone arguing Walton being number one in Blazers history. That to me is not a crazy argument at all. But for me, while his peak for that, 2 seasons basically is definitely higher than the other guys on the list, Lillard and Drexler. The longevity and the sustained success is not even close to those other guys, just due to those foot injuries and kind of the fallout from that. If you look at it, he lost his age 26, 28, 29, and part of his age 27 season. So you're talking 3.5 seasons of his pure middle of his prime. He ended up missing because of those injuries. Which sucks. And obviously Walton ended up, playing in the league until his mid-30s and won a championship with Boston eventually as kind of a 6-man role. But it's kind of crazy how, how different his career might have been if, either he didn't get injured at all, or maybe, at the very least, if his injuries were handled properly. It's a foot injury with a big guy, so you never know what could happen. They're always kind of a crapshoot with foot injuries with 7-footers, but it is interesting to think about what his career and some of these other guys we're about to talk about could look like without those injury histories that they had. So that kind of brings me to my next point, and something I noticed, and it's been mentioned before, but it's something I definitely noticed when I was kind of going through the lists. Portland's track record with major injuries to stars or even potential stars, it's crazy. So you have Brandon Roy, who we've talked about, microfracture knee injuries, played 5 years, was done. Bill Walton, foot injuries, played 4 years in Portland, wasn't the same after, so done. Then you have other guys that never really got to the point of Roy or Walton, but based on their, where they were drafted and their potential, they definitely were kind of on the trajectory, and the big one is Greg Oden. It's crazy, we got 60 total games of Greg Oden that's at least semi-healthy, and those teams, I think, went 50-12. So it's insane to think about how Portland's trajectory as a franchise has been altered in such a great way by these major injuries to these guys. Greg Oden being kind of the poster boy of it. Other couple guys I saw have similar things are Sam Bowie, who was drafted super high. He came in with some injury history, but still, when you draft a guy, in the top, I think it was maybe second or third overall. It was second overall because he was taken above Michael Jordan. It's insane to think about where Portland may have been had these guys stayed healthy. And they have this bad track record, and it comes down. You start to ask the questions of, well, why is that, right? They've had all these young guys, and most of them big men, but not all of them, that have these major injuries where they either never play again, like in the case of Brandon Roy and Greg Oden. I guess Greg Oden played a little bit in Miami, but still, he was a shell of himself as a player, or, they just aren't quite the same, right? Like Bill Walton still played, and he was an effective player. I think he won Sixth Man of the Year on one of those Boston teams, but he wasn't the same, right? So it asks kind of why this happened. Asking why this happened, there probably is a combination of things attributed to this, but there are kind of three things I think of. One of it's just bad luck, right? There's cases where guys get injured randomly. Jamal Murray a couple years ago, he just happened to go up, among the bodies to the rim, kind of landed weird, tore his ACL. Like, stuff like that happens in sports. It's going to happen. But then you have the things that I think are more in the franchise's control. The other thing being poor injury management by the franchise. This is obviously highlighted by Walton's issues with the franchise. You would think, between Walton and Brandon Roy and Greg Oden, you're talking 30 to 40 years of time. You would think there'd be improvements or something so it doesn't happen again, but it's a recurring thing, so it does question of what is it just like what's happening in Portland to cause this, where injury management by the franchise just is not good. And then the other thing that probably gets overlooked a little bit is in their draft process, just being more dismissive of injury concerns on guys. So like Sam Bowie, for example, he missed 2 years of college due to a leg injury. So going into the NBA, there's a risk there. And you would think that if a team already has some of these historical issues with injuries, at the very least, I would think you would try to go for guys that don't already have that injury history. Saying, hey, if we can at least keep him from getting injured, then we don't have to worry about mismanaging his injury, right? So yeah, it was something that kind of struck me when I was going through Portland's history, but it does kind of make you wonder how franchises, or how Portland's franchise would kind of look historically, kind of in the basketball zeitgeist, if these things wouldn't have happened. Would they have won more championships with Walton in the late 70s, early 80s? I mean, maybe. With the core of Greg Oden, Brandon Roy, and LaMarcus Aldridge, would they have won a ring? I mean, like I said, they were, I think, 50-12 in the 62 games or whatever the number is that Oden played. They had a ridiculously good winning percentage. And they were all still really young. So you talk about them staying healthy in that core. That's probably good for at least one championship, right? If things kind of break the right way. But then you also look at the kind of the other way, if those Oden, Roy, Aldridge teams are good and they stay healthy, are they drafting high enough to even draft Damian Lillard? So even some of this stuff is kind of impacting the NBA today. And, maybe we're talking about Portland differently if things had broken a different way. So now we've gone through the injury stuff. We can get to two guys that really never were injured, or at least not nearly as bad. So we're between Clyde and Lillard here. This is at the point where you might as well just flip a coin. You're splitting hairs between these guys. They both were ridiculous. They were both super important for their teams. I could honestly do this 100 different times and have 50 different times I'm going for Clyde number one, 50 other times where I'm going for Lillard for number one. So, this is definitely kind of a coin flip. But I guess let's talk about they're comparing these two guys first. So Clyde Drexler, who I have at number 2, drafted 14th overall by Portland in 1983, played 12 seasons there before being traded to Houston in 1995, where he eventually did win a championship in Houston. He was an 8-time All-Star, 5-time All-NBA. He was second in MVP voting in 1992. He did lead Portland to the finals in 1990 and 1992. They ended up losing both, the first one to Detroit and then the second to Chicago. But there's a lot of guys that don't even get to the finals. So I will still mark that as an accomplishment because it obviously is. Over his 12 seasons, he averaged 20.8 points, 6.2 rebounds, 5.7 assists, and 2.1 steals. I did not, again, this is Clyde's a little before my time. I did not realize he was such a thief with all the steal numbers. He actually holds the record for most steals and a half of a game at 8 of them. And he also is currently sitting 9th all-time for career steals. So while he's definitely more known for, his athleticism and his offensive play, he's a damn good defensive player, at least from a statistical point of view. During his time, he's consistently among the best all-around players. He's one of only 6 players in NBA history with 20,000 points, 6,000 rebounds, and 6,000 assists. So you're talking stat stuff or type of stuff. The other 5 players, if you're curious, are Oscar Robinson, Havlicek, Kobe, LeBron, and Westbrook. So that's a pretty good group to be grouped with as a player. Again, known for his athleticism and finishing ability. He did eventually actually develop a pretty good jump shot. He eventually shot 36% from 3 in 94-95. So that also is a guy that, kind of shown by the numbers, he was able to improve himself in important parts of the game, especially as he shifted to the 90s and the three-point shot became more and more viable as an option. Another just kind of a more fun fact thing, he did participate in 5 different dunk contests in the mid to late 80s and didn't win any of them. I think one of them he lost to Michael Jordan. Again, this is a time when star players did things like the dunk contest, so I think he had much stiffer competition than if someone like him were to do the dunk contest today. Nowadays, it's basically end of bench guys that come to the dunk contest, which kind of sucks for the fans. So yeah, he was an incredibly important player in the early to mid 90s. Led him to 11 consecutive playoff appearances, including those deep playoff runs I've already mentioned, and then a season where they won 63 games, which is incredibly impressive. 63 games is a lot. He is right now he's first in Blazers history in steals, triple doubles in games, along with a bunch of other categories, advanced statistics, things like that. And then he's also second in many other categories like points, rebounds. So now you're probably asking, well, he's second in points. Who's number 1? Well, it's the other guy we're going to talk about, Damian Lillard. Just to get a quick summary on him, you guys are probably a little more aware of his game because he's still playing in the league today. As of now, drafted by Portland 6th overall in 2012. As of now, he's played 11 years in Portland. And I guess we'll see what happens in the next couple months given his current trade request situation. Personally, it probably makes sense for Portland to move him, but it wouldn't surprise me if it doesn't happen until closer to the trade deadline because as of right now, which is, we're in August, the only offer I've even heard floated out there is the Miami one, which isn't super fantastic. Might as well wait till February and see if we can get something better for him. So yeah, 7-time All-Star, 7-time All-NBA, 2013 unanimous Rookie of the Year. In his 11 years, he's averaging 25.2 points per game, 4.2 rebounds, 6.7 assists, and a steal. Plus he's shooting 37.2 from 3%. From 3. So, you watch him, he's one of the premier scorers in the NBA, one of the the best 3-point shooters, and one of the few guys that I think realistically should extend his range to 30 feet. It's basically Lillard and Curry, and then I guess Trae Young. And outside of that, I don't really think anyone should be shooting from 30 plus feet out. But Lillard's one of those guys. Obviously he's definitely more of an offensive player. It's not a great defender, doesn't have a huge amount of, he's decent size for a point guard, but not oversized like a lot of point guards today. And like I said, he's the all-time leader in points and threes in Blazers history, and he's near the top or at the top of a bunch of other statistics and metrics. So now I guess let's talk about why I went with Lillard over Drexler. We kind of went over their resumes, and like I said before, this is splitting hairs between the guys. It's basically a 1A and 1B type of situation. But for me, I think it's those additional individual accolades of Lillard. So the extra All-NBA, the unanimous Rookie of the Year, those are kind of the reasons I chose Lillard. I know Drexler has the 2 finals appearances, though they didn't win. And then in terms of those finals appearances, and kind of when you dig deeper into those rosters, between the best rosters that Drexler was on that went to the finals versus the best ones that Lillard was on, Lillard has had a larger burden in comparison in terms of responsibility on the team. So what I did is, let's take a look at the peak of the early 90s Blazers teams, or late 80s, early 90s, and then kind of compare it to the peak teams with Dame's. So for the early 90s teams, the peak of the Blazers in that time era was from the 1987-88 season to the 1992-93 season. So we're talking 6 seasons. During that time, they had win totals of 53, 39, 59, 63, 57, 51. So you essentially 5 of the 6 years they're winning at least 50 games, which is, that's one of the best teams in the NBA year in and year out will win that number of games, including a 63 win year as well. And during that time they had the finals appearances, the extra Western Conference final run, so they had the playoff success to kind of back it up. Now, in those 6 seasons, if we don't include Clyde Drexler, the Blazers had 5 other All-Star selections. So Steve Johnson had 1, Kevin Duckworth had 2, and Terry Porter also had 2. Now, if we look at Dame's teams from that best 6-year span that he had, that'd be from 2013-14 to 2018-19, they've had win totals of 54, 51, 44, 41, 49, 53. And that 53 was actually when they went to the Western Conference Finals. So you're talking teams that still were in the playoff hunt every year, or, one of the top seeds in the West, in that 54, 51, and 53 win seasons. So the win totals aren't quite as good as Clyde's team, but they're still, pretty damn good teams. Now, in those 6 seasons with Dame, if you don't include his All-Star selections, the Blazers had a total of 2 All-Star selections outside of Dame Lillard. Both of those belong to LaMarcus Aldridge in kind of the first 2 years of that 6-year run. So 2013-14 and 2014-15. So my point is that while Drexler definitely has had greater playoff success, I don't think anyone would really argue, he definitely has had a lot more help getting there. You had 3 different players over that 6-year span combined for 5 other All-Star selections, while Dame, in that 6-year span, had 2 All-Star selections from 1 guy, and those were the first 2 years of that 6-year run. So that Western Conference Final run where they won 53 games, Dame was it. That he was the only guy on that team. So that's part of the reason why, or at least a decent reason why I have Lillard slightly over Clyde. Between, again, the slightly better individual honors and the lack of help that Dame has had, to me that puts Dame slightly higher than Clyde Drexler. But it's by 0.1% if you're putting a number on it. So yeah, like I said, really splitting hairs. So yeah, I think that's Portland's top 5 all time. Just a quick recap. At number 5, we have Brandon Roy. Number 4, LaMarcus Aldridge. Number 3, Bill Walton. Number 2, Clyde Drexler. And then number 1, Damian Lillard. So yeah, that's it for Portland's Rafter Rankings all-time top 5. And the next episode, we'll hit up another team and figure out what their top 5 is all-time. All right, that's it for me for this episode of the Initial NBA Show. Thank you so much for listening. Don't forget to hit that follow button or like the podcast, whatever platform you're on. Until the next podcast comes out, don't forget to follow me on the socials, mostly Instagram, Twitter, or X, or whatever name it's going to be next week, and then Threads. I've been trying to post just kind of supplemental stuff daily on those platforms, so don't forget to give me a follow. It is at Initial NBA Show on all platforms. So thank you for listening, and I will see you guys in the next one.